Welcome back, U.S. history students. We covered the European theater of war today in class, and as we get into our big topic of discussion tomorrow, specifically looking at the atomic bomb, the United States' decision to drop it on two cities in Japan, we need to understand what's going on in the Pacific theater of war that leads up to this big kind of really humongous historic event in the course of human history and how we got to the point where we're ready to drop an atomic weapon. So we're looking at what's going on in the Pacific and what's happening between the United States and Japan in terms of warfare. So remember, Japan, if we think back to early in our unit, and really our first learning target that's looking at the expansion of powers and the rise of fascism. Japan is expanding all across the Pacific. Japan needs uh, natural resources like coal and oil and steel, and they need to start expanding into these islands and into China if they're going to continue to grow as a nation and then as well continue to fight in World War II. So between January and February of 1942, just a month and 2 months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Japan begins to heavily expand and they take over the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies down here. The Dutch East Indies are colonies of different European countries. Europe doesn't have any time to fight back against Japan because they're too busy fighting Hitler over in Europe. And what's significant here is that the Philippines, and if we think all the way back to Unit 2 and imperialism, we know that the United States gets control of the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. And it's pretty interesting to see that Japan is actually taking over some land that is owned by the United States. Not only are they attacking us, but they're taking over some of our colonial holdings over here in the Pacific. Really just shows how big of a power Japan was becoming around the world. They weren't just some small military looking to expand. They were a force to be reckoned with, and they were ready to attack the United States and even take over some of our land. So between January and February of 1942, they really redoubled their efforts in expanding throughout the Pacific, inching ever closer to the United States and islands that are over here closer to the United States. So by April of 1942, we bring the war to the mainland in Japan. We begin bombing Tokyo, being their main capital city, and also other parts of mainland Japan, which is a big deal because we're bringing the war to the actual physical country of Japan, to the Japanese people. The war wasn't necessarily being fought in other places, and it's not them attacking Pearl Harbor. We're bringing the war to them. We're showing Japan that we are not just going to let them continue to expand, and this war that we entered in to fight against them in part is definitely going to happen, and it's going to happen on a large scale. We're not just going to be pushed around. So by April of 1942, we're actually starting to bomb Japan, starting this back and forth between our two countries. Also in April of 1942, we attempt to take back control of the Philippines. It's really embarrassing for us on an international scale to have one of our land holdings taken over by our enemies. So we really tried, along with the Filipino military that is in place there, try to take back Japan. It didn't work, or excuse me, try to take back the Philippines. It did not work. In fact, we failed pretty miserably. And over 70, let's see, what would that be? 78,000 troops, 66,000 being Filipino troops, and 12,000 of our United States troops get captured by the Japanese military. In the event that happens afterwards is something referred to as the Bataan Death March. Bataan was an area of the Philippines, of those kind of collection of islands, the Bataan Peninsula. And the Japanese military rounded up all of our troops and the Filipino troops and marched them 60 miles north to a set of prison camps that they had set up for our troops. And along the way, the march itself consisted of brutal conditions. It was hot, it was humid, they were not given adequate food, water, or any other supplies to live off of, and also were subject to a lot of humiliation, torture, and even executions. The Japanese kind of saw this as a way to humiliate their enemies, being us, the United States, and kind of make the statement that they are going to destroy us, our military, and ultimately our country. So what's called the Bataan Death March is the Japanese military marching these soldiers 60 miles through terrible conditions and subjecting them to pretty brutal, horrible treatment. You see pictures here of our soldiers who are clearly malnourished, were not given adequate supplies, were forced to walk through very hot conditions. It was not at all something that is deemed okay by today's modern warfare standards. See executions happening. Many soldiers died both from malnourishment and heat exhaustion and execution on the Bataan Death March. We see another collection of U.S. soldiers being rounded up here, continued to be forced to march no matter what. So we have some pretty brutal treatment of U.S. soldiers on behalf of the Japanese. By June of 1942, Japan is pushing farther and farther into the Pacific Ocean, closer to our west coast. And we have this group of islands here that are called the Midway Islands. They are called the Midway Islands because, pretty obviously enough here, they are midway between Japan and the United States. And the Midway Islands are kind of a turning point in the battle in the Pacific between the United States and Japan. Because if Japan were to fully gain control of the Midway Islands, they're a hop, skip, and a jump away from Hawaii. And if taking over Hawaii would really start to signal that the United States was losing the ability to defend ourselves as a nation. And Japan wanted to continue to expand out. So they attempt to take control of the Midway Islands. And that's really what's guarding Hawaii for us at the time. And what's called the Battle of the Midway, one of the most fierce naval battles and Air Force battles in United States military history, happens in June of 1942. The battle rages for about a month. And it was going back and forth constantly. We lost many men and especially military equipment, and so did the Japanese. But the United States, we were successful in beating back the Japanese forces, and we kept control of the Midway Islands. And this is a huge turning point for the reason that that is as far as Japan was ever able to expand. The Midway Islands were as far as the Japanese ever got in terms of an actual military stronghold. And after we win this battle, we start to begin to shrink Japan's empire here that they had built. Through this concept and this term that's on your study guide, it's called island hopping. And kind of our whole strategy here is to go to these islands that Japan controls in these different areas one by one. Fight very brutally, take it over, set up another military base, set up an airstrip so we can bring in planes, set up a harbor where we can bring in equipment and soldiers and house soldiers, and then once we're established there, move on to the next one and do the same exact thing. So basically taking over these islands, getting rid of the Japanese forces there, and setting them up kind of as our own military strongholds. That's that concept of island hopping. And after the Battle of the Midway, we start to take over all of these small islands around in here that you can't even really see on this map, and also some of the bigger places here that Japan had taken control of. So this is a turning point in the war in the Pacific. So we talked a lot about minority groups in class the other day on Monday about really the minority experience in the war. And someone that we left out was the Native American groups. And Native Americans actually played a pretty key role in the war in the Pacific, specifically the Navajo Native Americans due to their use of the Navajo language. So we are in a military battle. You need to have a code that you can transmit over the radio, that you can give information to your soldiers and to your units all over the world without necessarily giving away that information. You don't want the enemy to be able to understand what you're planning to do. And many codes are being devised, different ways in which this information can be passed along secretly, but the Japanese keep breaking this code. One way that we figured out, and this is where the Native Americans come in, is that Native American languages, specifically the Navajo language, are not spoken anywhere else in the world. They're only part of the United States. And there's not even that many Navajo speaking people left in the United States. They're the only ones in the world that actually know this language. The Japanese have no idea that exists. So we actually brought a bunch of Native Americans into the Marine Corps to use the Navajo language as code to transmit highly classified information over the radio. And this is going to ensure that Japan isn't going to be able to break the code because they have absolutely no knowledge of the Navajo language. There's the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is actually the background of this slide presentation here, where we have U.S. soldiers raising the flag on the island of Iwo Jima. It's a very famous battle, a very long, bloody battle during the war in the Pacific, and the Navajo code talkers were essential to the United States winning that battle, which is another huge turning point in the war. So we actually have Native Americans bringing their culture and bringing their language to the war to assist. Again, this is total war. African Americans, Asian Americans, women, Native Americans, everyone is being asked to participate and do their part in order for the United States to win the war. Even a group of people who had suffered some pretty poor treatment over the years. So by July of 1944, we continued to battle all throughout 1942 and 1943. Japan was starting to get pretty beaten back here. The United States liberates Guam, which is also very significant because it's one of our colonies that we once had, that we gained in the Spanish-American War. And we really start to eat away at Japanese territory by the middle of 1944. We're starting to close in on them, but there's still the Japanese mainland. There's still the strongholds that they have in China that we just really have no way of defeating at the moment without engaging in a physical invasion. By August of 1945, the United States makes a huge decision, which is going to be our focus all day in class tomorrow, about dropping the atomic bomb. This is the most terrible weapon in all of human history, the most terrible weapon ever created. And we decide that it's something that is necessary in our effort to end the war. The first and only time atomic weapons have been used in the history of the world. And we are going to discuss why the United States decided that this was the only way to end the war and physically get Japan to surrender without maybe having to engage in some other tactics or military measures that we had no real intention of doing. So make sure you guys have all the notes for this in class tomorrow. We'll be working with it right away.